This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. Cybersecurity Awareness Month is still going strong, and LifeLock is here with a message about phishing, the scam cybercriminals use to trick victims into allowing access to their devices so they can steal their personal info. Being aware of phishing scams is one way to help protect yourself. For comprehensive identity theft protection, there's LifeLock. Start protecting your identity today with a 30-day free trial at LifeLock.com/podcast.
Streaming only on Peacock.
Being with Finch felt like I was in some fairy tale.
She's like, I write for Grey's Anatomy. I was like, what?
Her writing was so highly regarded because Finch had been through so much.
A Hollywood writer's life.
When you love somebody, you'll ignore red flags so they're hitting you in the head.
Filled with fiction.
She would do whatever it takes to get ahead.
She's sort of like a TV series.
I don't know who my wife is.
Anatomy of Lies. Streaming October 15th, only on Peacock.
It was all a lie.
Welcome back to Murder in the Black. It is your host, Steph.
And I'm MD.
Let's go ahead and get into our true crime case for today.
So grab your coffee if it's the morning, your lemonade if it's the afternoon, and your wine if it's the evening. Either way, let's get into it.
Today we will be covering the case entitled Hearts of Charlotte, Remembering 11 Daughters Lost. We're covering a case that shocked the city of Charlotte, North Carolina in the early 1990s. We'll be discussing the life and crimes of Henry Louis Wallace, also known as the Taco Bell Strangler. MD, have you heard of this case, or maybe?
Briefly, I've heard some things. I remember something about Taco Bell killings and of that such, but never went down the rabbit hole to really uncover all the tea.
This is particularly a disturbing case that highlights not only brutality of a serial killer, but also raises question about law enforcement responses and the value placed on victims' lives. Before we dive in, we want to warn our listeners that this episode contains descriptions of violence and sexual assault. This case is not for the faint of heart. That is your trigger warning. Let's start by giving you background on Henry Louis Wallace. He was born on November 4th, 1965 in Barnwell, South Carolina. Wallace's early life was marked by hardship and abuse. He was born to Lottie Mae Wallace, and his father was reportedly a married school teacher who left after learning of the pregnancy. How convenient.
So convenient.
Wallace grew up in a home without running water or electricity, often living with his mother's older sister and his great-grandmother.
It's clear that Wallace's childhood was far from ideal. His mother, who worked long hours at a textile company, was described as neglectful, verbally and physically abusive. She was known to be very strict, and she had little patience for her children. And Steph, this always irritates my whole soul, because if you cannot have patience for kids, let's stop having them.
I say it as a joke, but I'm being very serious. There needs to be some type of test or criteria that people have to meet in order to have children, because how don't you have any patience?
Right.
Or gain some.
But specifically, if you recognize, I don't have any patience, because maybe after the first one, maybe before you had some, you didn't realize that's very possible. But after the first one, and you recognize, I don't have patience, maybe, just maybe, we should stop.
Right.
Sources indicate that Wallace's mother would even make her children whip each other as a form of discipline when she was too tired to do it herself. This kind of upbringing undoubtedly had a profound impact on Wallace's psychological development. It's worth noting that at the age of 8, Wallace reportedly witnessed a gang sexual assault. And according to A&E's First Blood, this is when Wallace claims he started having violent fantasies about dominating women. It seems that Wallace's violent tendencies began to manifest early on, and at the age of 16, he reportedly attempted to sexually assault his friend's younger sister, and he began to have rough sex with sex workers at the age of 16. Despite his troubled home life, Wallace managed to do relatively well in school. He attended Barnwell High School, where he served on the student council and became the school's only male cheerleader. So I always think that is so cool when I see male cheerleaders, because it's such a sport that's dominated by women. So when you have these male cheerleaders, they obviously stick out and they do pretty well. After graduating, he even worked as a DJ for a local radio station.
It's interesting how Wallace seemed to lead a double life. On the surface, he appeared to be a well-mannered, respectful young man. The station owner, Drew Wilder, described him as having good manners. However, Wallace was fired after being suspected of stealing CDs. Lord.
That definitely ages this story for sure.
I was like, I know some of our listeners like, CD?
What is a CD?
Ooh. So this pattern of presenting a likable facade while engaging in criminal behavior would continue throughout Wallace's life. In 1985, at the age of 20, he joined the U.S. Navy and married his high school sweetheart, Maretta Barham. But it wasn't long before things started to unravel. Wallace began using drugs, primarily crack cocaine, and started burglarizing homes and businesses to fund his habit. This led to his arrest in January of 1988 for breaking into a hardware store in Washington State, where he was stationed. Wallace's criminal activities continued to escalate, and in March of 1990, he committed his first known murder. The victim was 18-year-old Tashonda Bethia in Barnwell, South Carolina. This is where Wallace's killing spree began. Tashonda Bethia was a high school student from Barnwell, South Carolina, Wallace's hometown. The murder took place on March 8, 1990. While the exact details of the murder are not explicitly provided in the given documents, it is mentioned that Wallace typically strangled his victims. Given this pattern, it's likely that he used a similar method to kill Bethia, although this is not confirmed for this specific case. Bethia's body was discovered on April 1st, 1990, nearly a month after her murder. Her remains were found floating in a pond in Barnwell. After the discovery of Bethia's body, Wallace was questioned by authorities but was not charged at the time. This lack of immediate arrest allowed Wallace to continue his criminal activities unchecked for several years. He had thoroughly cleaned his car, removing any potential evidence. After this first murder, Wallace relocated to Charlotte, North Carolina in 1992. It was here that his crimes would escalate dramatically over the next 2 years.
Now, between 1992 and 1994, Wallace murdered at least 10 women in the Charlotte area. So we're going to cover some of these particularly violent crimes. Caroline Love was 20 years old, and she was murdered in June 1992. Wallace raped and strangled her at her apartment, then dumped her body in a wooden area. After killing her, Wallace, along with Carolina Love's sister and his girlfriend, filed a missing persons report at the police station. He literally kills her and then goes and meets up with Carolina Love's sister, and they go file a police report saying that she's missing.
He played the good guy. So when everybody was looking for Caroline Love, he was right there with them.
Right.
Making his mark and definitely being a person who would want to participate in the investigation of his crime, which I think is bonkers.
It's definitely bizarre, and it definitely screams crazy. Now, Carolina Love's body was not discovered until almost 2 years later in March of 1994, after Wallace had been arrested.
Right. Our next victim is Shauna Hawk. She was 20 years old, murdered on February 19th, 1993. Wallace strangled her at home after first raping her. Hawk's body was discovered in her bathtub by her boyfriend, Daryl Kirkpatrick, who had gone to check on her after she failed to pick up her godson from daycare. Emergency personnel were called, but Hawk was pronounced dead at the hospital.
Then we have Audrey Spain, and she was 24. She was murdered on June 22nd, 1993. Wallace raped and strangled her as well. Spain's body was discovered on June 25th, 1993, when maintenance personnel from her apartment complex entered her apartment through a sliding glass door. Dr. Sullivan's autopsy, who was the ME, revealed that Spain had been strangled with a ligature made from a t-shirt and a bra. So he put together a t-shirt and a bra, and that's how he strangled her.
Next is Valencia Jumper. She was 21 years old and was murdered August 10th, 1993. Wallace raped and strangled her, then set her body on fire to cover up the crime. Jumper's body was discovered when firefighters responded to a fire at her apartment in the early morning of August 10th. Initially, her death was thought to be caused by an accidental fire, which was the reason why he set everything on fire. But the cause was later amended to strangulation after Wallace's confession.
We have Michelle Stinson, and she was 20 years old, was murdered on September 15th, 1993. Wallace strangled Stinson with a towel and then stabbed her approximately 4 times. So we're seeing that he's escalating, and he's still using some of the same methodology with the strangulation, but the previous case, he set the body on fire. This case, he ended up stabbing Michelle 4 times. Stinson's body was discovered by her friends, James Mays, who had come to visit her, and Mays found Stinson lying on the kitchen floor with blood all around her after her children told him that their mother was sleeping on the floor.
So just to provide a little bit more detail there, he came and checked in on her, and her kids were there when he raped and killed her. They were present. And Mays comes in and he's, "Hey, where's your mom?" And they're like, "Oh, she's just on the floor sleeping." I can't imagine that type of trauma on those children that they still have to think back, especially the oldest, because they were young. But knowing that you were present for your mother's death is wild. The next victim is Vanessa Mack, 5 years old, and was murdered on February 20th, 1994. Wallace raped and strangled her with a pillowcase and another garment. This, not only is he escalating, there is a pattern of behavior with the strangulation. He's getting something that is nearby and using that to strangle them. Mack's body was discovered by her mother, Barbara Rippey, who had come to pick up Mack's youngest daughter. Rippey found Mack partially dressed on the bed with a towel wrapped around her neck. After the murder, Wallace attempted to use Mack's bank card at a nearby ATM. Vanessa fought for her life, and she got the last tee because it's wrong, sir. The police were able to get ATM footage. And this is where there was a slight break in this case. As we'll get into more of the investigation, we'll see that obviously these were a string of murders for years. Initially, investigators did not know that it was connected, but a lot of the community and some of the victims' mothers knew that it was connected.
Right.
You can clearly see
there's a pattern here.
Right. This was the biggest break because when they were able to obtain this footage, they were able to see that it was a Black man who wore a dangling cross earring. I just have to say, people who wear that dangling cross earring, that is a red flag. No, just play.
Red flag.
Oh,
get that earring out.
Yes, please. But they were ultimately unable to ID the suspect. But this small detail of a Black man wearing a dangling earring comes back later on in the case.
Our next victim is Betty Baucom, 24 years old. She was murdered on March 9th, 1994. Wallace raped and strangled her. Then he stole her car. Now, when Baucom's body was discovered on March 10th, the next day, police entered her apartment and found her lying face down on her bed with a towel wrapped around her neck. And the police got word that she was missing, so they did a wellness check, and that's how they discovered her body.
Brandy Henderson, 18 at the time of her murder, she was murdered on March 9th, 1994. Wallace raped and strangled her while she was holding her 10-month-old son.
This is so disgusting.
Henderson's 10-month-old son was found with a pair of shorts around his neck, and he was later discovered by his father. Henderson's body was discovered in her bedroom at the Lake Apartment complex in East Charlotte. Her son, Tyrese Woods, survived the attack, and despite being strangled, he lived, but also lived with the trauma of that incident as well.
Absolutely, because while he was very young, that kind of trauma it stays with you. Our final victim is Deborah Slaughter. Deborah was 35 years old when she was murdered on March 12, 1994. Wallace raped, strangled, and stabbed her 38 times in the stomach and chest. Slaughter's body was found on March 12, 1994 at the Lake Apartment complex. She fought her attacker and she fought him hard, as evidenced by the multiple stab wounds. These murders were part of Wallace's killing spree that terrorized Charlotte, North Carolina between 1992 and 1994. Now, what's particularly disturbing about this case is that Wallace knew many of his victims personally. He often worked with them or was connected to them through a friend or family member. This personal connection allowed Wallace to gain access to his victim's home without really raising suspicion. So, for example, when Vanessa Mack allowed Wallace into her home with her children there, she did so thinking, this is somebody that I know, not somebody that is a perfect stranger. He would often strike up a conversation before attacking his victims, using a chokehold to subdue them. Wallace's crimes followed a very similar pattern, as Steph and I have already mentioned. He would sexually assault his victims, then he would strangle them, and then often steal money or some kind of valuable item from their home. And in some cases, he would even return to the crime scene to stage the areas or make additional phone calls to throw off investigators. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of this case is how long it took for authorities to connect the dots. Despite the similarities and the pattern that Steph and I have mentioned, it wasn't until several victims had been killed before the police began to suspect that maybe this is a serial killer.
And I know you're probably pissed, but this delay in recognizing the pattern has been a point of controversy. Many, including family members of the victims, have argued that race played a role in the slow investigation. All of Wallace's victims were young Black women. Dee Sumner, the mother of the victim, Shauna Hawk, was quoted as saying, "They don't give enough value to Black women's lives. It just didn't matter to them." This sentiment was echoed by many in the community who felt the cases weren't given the attention they deserved. It's a troubling aspect of this case. We here on Murder in the Black often talk about our cases being dismissed. What do you think about that, Indy?
I completely agree. I think that Malcolm X said it best. Black women, and I'm going to probably butcher this quote, Steph, so you'll have to educate us if I do, but Black women are the most underrepresented, appreciated person in America. And it just, you see that evidenced in this case in particular, but you see that evidence when a Black kid goes missing, a Black, young girl goes missing, or a Black woman goes missing. It doesn't have the same urgency that we see in our counterparts, right? And and I know, listening to this broadcast, whether you're Black, white, or any other color in between, we all can agree on this, that when white women go missing, that raises a big alarm. It sounds the bells. We hear about it from here to kingdom come. And not that that shouldn't happen, because that's definitely not what I'm saying. But what should happen is that same level of urgency when anybody goes missing. Because like Steph and I always say, we all deserve that.
That quote is, "The most disrespected person in America is the Black woman. The most unprotected person in America is the Black woman. The most neglected person in America is the Black woman."
I knew I was going to butcher it, but I was given the summary.
You got the gist of it. The Charlotte Police Department was severely understaffed at the time of these murders, with only 6 to 8 detectives handling not just murders, but also natural deaths, accidents, suicides, and missing person cases. Detective Gary McFadden, who worked on the Wallace murders, admitted that they were working under very difficult conditions. He stated, "We never had time to collaborate. We never had time to give cases a lot of attention." The breaking point came in March of 1994 when Wallace committed 3 murders in just 3 days, which are the last 3 victims that we talked to you guys about. These were the murders of Betty Baucom, Deborah Slaughter, and Brandy Henderson. This rapid escalation finally led investigators to connect the cases and identify Wallace as a suspect. Wallace was arrested on March 13th, 1994, initially for an outstanding larceny warrant. The similarities in the victims' profiles and the method of killing, strangulation, alerted them to the pattern. 2 crucial pieces of evidence led to Wallace's identification. Brandy Henderson's boyfriend told the police that Henderson was shy and would have only opened her door to 2 people, one of whom was Wallace. Also, the police found a palm print on Betty Baucom's stolen car, which was discovered behind a shopping center. On March 11th, they received a match for his print. Now, to circle back to that ATM surveillance footage, an ATM photo showed a man using Vanessa Mack's bank card after her death. The man in the photo wore that dangling cross earring, matching Wallace's arrest photo from an earlier shoplifting incident. On March 13, 1994, Officer Gilbert Allred and Sidney Wright found Wallace hiding in the bathroom of a friend's East Side apartment.
Detectives Mark Corin and Daryl Price conducted an extensive interrogation of Wallace. And after hours of questioning and deflection from Wallace, Detective Tony Rice joined the interrogation around 5 a.m. Now, Rice led a prayer session during this interrogation, which I think is pretty astounding. And after that prayer session, Wallace began to confess. So thank God for that. Wallace wrote down the names of his victims, and he surprised the detectives with the extent of his crimes. He confessed to 11 murders in total, including one in Barnwell, South Carolina, which they would have never pieced to this series of crimes. Police had found Wallace's palm print, as we stated earlier, on Betty Baucom's stolen car, which was a crucial piece of physical evidence that linked him to the crimes, because although you have his confession, you want to have as many additional pieces of evidence as you can in case the case does go to trial, so that you can debunk any theories that the defense may try to argue at trial. In summary, the combination of physical evidence, the palm print, the eyewitness testimony, Henderson's boyfriend who said she would only open the door for one of 2 people, the surveillance footage, which was the ATM photo, and just the astute police work in connecting the similar murders led to Wallace's identification and finally his arrest. During questioning, he confessed to 10 murders in Charlotte and led police to Caroline Love's body, which had been missing for nearly 2 years.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. Cybersecurity Awareness Month is still going strong, and LifeLock is here with a message about phishing, the scam cybercriminals use to trick victims into allowing access to their devices so they can steal their personal info. Being aware of phishing scams is one way to help protect yourself. For comprehensive identity theft protection, there's LifeLock. Start protecting your identity today with a 30-day free trial at LifeLock.com/podcast.
The trial began in September of 1996 with the prosecution seeking the death penalty. Wallace's defense team argued that he was mentally ill and unable to form the specific intent necessary for first-degree murder. Despite these arguments, on January 7, 1997, Wallace was found guilty of 9 counts of first-degree murder, along with counts of rape, sexual offense, assault, and robbery. On January 29th, 1997, Wallace was sentenced to 9 death sentences. After his sentencing, he made a statement to his victims' families saying, "None of these women, none of your daughters, mothers, sisters, or family members in any way deserve what they got. They did nothing to me that warranted their death." Wallace is currently on death row at Central Prison in Raleigh, North Carolina, awaiting execution. His appeals to overturn his death sentences have been rejected. And I just think that's interesting that you can make a statement like that and then seek appeal.
Right. You know, for him, he's like, yeah.
What?
He's like, I did it, but I don't want death.
Boy, please.
I did it. I killed all of your people. They didn't deserve it. I absolutely deserve death, but I want you to give me grace.
That's wild.
It is. It's absolutely wild.
Yeah. So we want to take a moment to remember Wallace's victims. These were young women with lives, dreams, and families who loved them. Their stories deserve to be told and their memories honored.
Steph, what's your takeaways? We'll let you do that for the day.
I definitely believe that in this case, it's absolutely true that police did not do their due diligence because it was black women who were dying. And if you're wondering why they called it the Taco Bell murders, you're like, I ain't hear Taco Bell not once. But he worked at a series of fast food restaurants, one of which was Taco Bell. And that's how he would find his victims. He was a manager there. He would find his victims at Taco Bell, just to give you guys a little bit of reference. I think that they simply dismissed a lot of this because there was black women. But also, I think they were understaffed. Like, it's a matter of fact. It's not a matter of, do I think they were understaffed? No, they were absolutely understaffed at that time. And there was a lot of crimes going on in the area. If you only have 6 detectives working, you're just at a disadvantage. And unfortunately, that put the community at a disadvantage. It's just so sad that the resources couldn't be pulled together to identify who he was. And I think that is incredibly sad. And we have to do our part, especially law enforcement, because something can be done on a city council where you can allocate funds and there's a deficit. And so I just think, unfortunately, back in the 90s and just period, this still goes on now, people don't want to allocate the funds and they rather these type of things happen, or they allow it not because they want to. It's given permission to allow it when you don't allocate the funds that need to be allocated to get crimes solved. I don't want to spend too much time on Henry Wallace. He was obviously just a demon. That's all I got.
Facts. There's nothing more to be said about him.
So we want to give you guys a couple of questions to answer, or just some things to ponder. What factors do you think contributed to the delay in identifying Henry Louis Wallace as a serial killer? And how might law enforcement connected the dots sooner? Wallace was described as charming, and he was able to maintain a seemingly normal life. How does this align with or challenge common perceptions of serial killers? MD, I'm going to ask you that question before we close out.
I think that we need to change our perspective of serial killers. The fact that we think serial killers are going to, quote unquote, look like a serial killer is absolutely bizarre, because we have learned more than ever from documentaries on Netflix, Hulu, Amazon, and the like, that they don't have a particular look. They blend into society well. There obviously are going to be red flags, but usually only people close to them are going to see those red flags. And usually the people that are closest to you overlook those kinds of red flags, right? So I think that Wallace is like many serial killers that we've seen before. Seemingly normal, seemingly, does the right thing, does well in school, is an average kid in school, doesn't appear to stand out, is charming. I mean, I think that is probably one of the most renowned characteristics of most serial killers, is that they are charming, that people like them, that they don't seem to be people that you're like, oh, you're off in a way, or I don't really like you. You know, stay away from me. And not that those people can't be serial killers, but oftentimes it's the ones that look like you and I, and that blend into society like you and I. And so that's why you have to be careful and not be so trusting of strangers, and not be so trusting of even new people that you meet, because that's one of the things for me. Like, you can come to my house, but if you don't tell me you coming, you're not getting in. Like, I'm not answering the door. So I mean, and my point of that is that you have to have those kind of boundaries in place in your own life, and like always be watching, always be paying attention, because you just never know.
Yeah, for sure. And I loved Dexter, the show. And one of the things, or one of the traits about Dexter, is he tried to blend in to society. And he did a masterful job at it. It really is not the one you suspect. Usually it's the one you least suspect when it comes to serial killers. So we have another case where we will go into another serial killer. And this is kind of like my thing. I've been finding them all just around. That's the cases I've been trying to just research. I can't wait to share that particular case with you guys, because it actually came out of Grand Prairie, Texas. But shout out to my mom. She definitely is the one who sent us this case. She discovered it, and it was a case that I knew nothing about. Make sure you share, if you care, this episode with friends and family. We also ask that you become a part of our paid subscription, where we're trying to do new things there and trying to be creative, as well as give you more cases for you to enjoy, other than our weekly podcast that we share for free on Thursdays. Also, if you cannot do the paid subscription, but you just want to support us, definitely leave us a 5-star review on whatever listening platform you enjoy us on. Tell us how much you like it, what you like about it in particular, and just let us know what you think overall. Make sure you leave a comment on this particular podcast episode and tell us what you think about the law enforcement in Charlotte and how they could have done more in solving this particular case. Until next time, this is Murder in the Black.